All right, we're going to start with this. If you happen to be a guest today, if you are here for the first time, or maybe you're in church for the first time in a long time, maybe you've been to church some, but you're not really sure about this whole Jesus guy, and you're not really sure what it means to follow him, I'm going to address you first and foremost, all right? If that's you today, I want you to know that this message isn't for you. It's not for you, all right? And there's going to be some challenges in it. It's not necessarily for you, but I do want to give you permission to sit in and listen in. And I think that if you do, you're going to catch a glimpse of an incredible God, who he is, what he does, and it could just blow you away. All right? Number two, for those of you who are Jesus followers, I want you to take out your phones or take out a pen and some paper next to you, and I want you to text this phrase, "Is it me?" All right? And you can send that to someone that you trust, all right? But I want you to go ahead and do it. I'm giving you permission. Go ahead and get your phones out. I want you to text that phrase, "Is it me?" It might be weird for someone to just receive that, all right? And so you need to maybe write this. You might have to also text and say, "I'll explain later," okay? Maybe you don't text. Maybe there's someone sitting next to you that you could talk to, whatever else. Write it down, hand it to somebody. What I want you to do is I want to kind of put some accountability on you on the very front of this, okay? Because what we're going to talk about today will probably require a follow-up conversation for you, all right? So if that's you, go ahead, text that out, write that note, give it to somebody, and then put your phone back away, all right? We've been doing this Trail of Grace, and we've been looking at these little breadcrumbs of grace through the Old Testament. It's been a fun series for me. I've loved where this has gone so far. And there has been some powerful moments, and generally speaking, the application for every single one of these sermons has been the person, the individual. It's been you, okay? And so we've looked at creation. We've seen God's grace in creation. We even see his grace in the fall when sin enters the world. We've seen grace in the story of Abraham and Exodus. We've seen it in the Ten Commandments. And last week we even saw it in the story of David. And every single week as we've gone through this series and we've talked about grace in these unlikely places, okay? As we've looked at them, what we've come to is that at the end of it, the message is for us. It's for the individual. It's for the person. It's for me. It's for you, okay? That we see ourselves kind of in that center stage with the light on us, all right? The application is all about us and what we can do with it. We see who God is. We see his grace. We see this characteristic of who he is, and it causes us to just have this moment of overwhelmed like impression on us, right? That God would do something like this for us. It's always been about us. Today we're going to shift that. Today and next week, we're going to shift the perspective a little bit, and we're going to move ourselves out of center stage, and we're going to move to the side stage. And what we're going to do is we're going to sit back, and we're going to see what it looks like to observe grace. Not to experience it, not to receive it, but to observe it. And this week, we're going to be looking at what it looks like to watch someone else receive the grace of God. And we'll be following it through the story of Jonah. Now, you're probably familiar with the story. You don't have to go to church to know the Jonah story. You know that there was a guy who gets swallowed by a whale, right? It's a crazy story. And if you want, I would encourage you to do this. Go back and actually read it. It's a short book. Jonah's a prophet in the Old Testament. You can find it. You might have to go to the table of contents, okay? But you can find the book and read it. It's 4 chapters, and it's short chapters, not even long chapters, all right? So it's a very easy read. You can knock it out 10, 15 minutes, okay? And it's very straightforward. It's very straight to the point, and the very first thing we find, verse 2 of his book, as we're getting this story of God interacting with Jonah, verse 2 is right off the bat, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." So God gives Jonah this declaration. This is your job. You need to go do this. And then Jonah ran away. He's the complete opposite. He's a prophet of God who does the completely opposite thing of what God tells him to do. It should be surprising. We should ask the question, why? What would cause Jonah to want to go in the opposite direction? What would cause Jonah to run from this calling that God had given him? There's lots of potential answers. Maybe it's his own arrogance. Maybe it's some sort of concern about the unknown and not really sure how things are going to work out. Maybe it's some form of bigotry or hatred within him. Maybe it's fear. In fact, if you did a little bit of historical research, you would probably come to that conclusion. Jonah was probably scared. Scared is too nice of a word. He was terrified of these people. Nineveh was a city that did not belong to Israel. It was a city that belonged to a different nation known as the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were a particularly cruel people. Awful, hateful, miserable, mean. Like, mean isn't even strong enough. They were just awful, horrible people. They reveled in their violence and the ways in which they tortured and hurt people. In fact, they kind of turned cruelty into an art. And if there was ever a people in Jonah's day, if there was ever a people that would have deserved the judgment of God, it would have been them. And you would have to think that Jonah would have been excited to go and deliver this message from God, and yet he goes the other way. It's probably because he'd heard their stories. The Assyrians themselves told the stories. It's not like other people had to talk about it. The Assyrians bragged about it. They wrote it down. The kings had these annals full of all of these stories where they spoke in first person of the things that they had done, the awful, miserable things they had done to other people, stuff like this. They would flay or skin humans. One king bragged about skinning any noble who had rebelled against him. They would take those skins and they would drape them over piles of corpses, or sometimes they would drape them over the walls of the city to just kind of offer a warning to anybody else. One king carried captives and their possessions off, and he would cut off the heads of the fighters, and he would build towers with their heads. They would take the adolescent boys and girls from those cities that they had captured, and they would burn them. They said that they would capture troops alive. Sometimes they would cut off their limbs, their arms, or their hands. Sometimes they would cut off noses or ears or other extremities. They would gouge out their eyes. One king bragged about making a pile of living soldiers who were captive and a pile of heads. They would take the heads and sometimes hanging them around trees throughout the city. Jonah had to hear these stories, right? I mean, they bragged about this stuff. They bragged about it. In fact, they carved pictures. The Assyrians carved pictures into stone to highlight these actions that they had done, to celebrate their behaviors and what they had done. We're told that sometimes they would cut off the legs of people, and sometimes they would cut off like one arm but not the other one, because while the person laid there bleeding out, slowly dying, the Assyrian soldiers would come along and they would shake the hand that was still attached to the body in a sarcastic mocking of the person who was dying. Sometimes they forced the victims' friends and families to parade around the city or different courtyards carrying the decapitated head of their loved one. I mean, they didn't just hurt, they weren't just mean, they were ugly about it. They were violent, they were vicious, and they loved it, they celebrated it. It's hard for me to think about an equivalent. Like, if God came to me, who is it that I would run from? Who would I not want to preach to? Right? And I think back through my life, I don't have a lot of good examples or anything that would connect to that same sort of level of terror or fear of death that Jonah would have had in this moment. But I think back to like 9/11, and not just that moment, but the weeks and months that followed afterwards. And I imagine that if God had come to me and said, "Hey, Ben, I want you to take a commercial flight over to Afghanistan. Find some form of transportation, get up into the mountains, look for your local terrorist group, and see if you couldn't just tell them who I am." That would be great. And I imagine that I would probably go try to hide from God. Imagine I'd probably run away. Why did Jonah run away? It was probably his fear. Probably his fear. Hold on to that idea. You know the story. He runs away. He ends up on a ship out in the middle of a sea. God causes a storm to come up. Sailors are fearful of what's going on. Jonah has to convince them to throw him overboard. He says, "Just get rid of me, throw me in the water." They don't want to go for it, but initially, he eventually talks them into it. And so they eventually throw Jonah overboard, where he is swallowed by a fish, not a whale, but a fish. In chapter 2 of Jonah is a weird moment, all right? You think about all the weird things in the Bible. Jonah chapter 2 is the recorded prayer of Jonah from within inside of a fish. It's a weird idea, all right? But he prays this prayer. And it's strange. We don't know if he prayed this immediately. Like, I imagine there was probably some prayers as he's going through the digestive tract, all right? I don't know if this was after 3 days of being there. He's like, all right, you know what, I guess I got to talk to God about this. I don't know exactly when we read this prayer, but he has this weird prayer in this weird moment. It's a strange story, but I want to just pull this one thing out. This is almost like a little sidetrack, okay? Just a little extra bonus thing. I want you to see it. Steve read it from a different version just a moment ago. This is really interesting to me, okay? Chapter 2, verse 9. Among Jonah's prayer, he says this: those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. It's a fascinating comment to me. First of all, because that word grace is in there. I think that's really important because we're doing this trail of grace, and so we see the word of grace in this book of Jonah. That's important to me, but also because of this. Jonah is talking about these worthless idols that other people worship, and he's not like them, and they're forfeiting grace while he's inside of a fish because he's worshiping himself. Scared to do what God's called him to do. It's an interesting thing to me. Nonetheless, the fish eventually spits him out. He ends up on dry land, and right out the bat, God goes right back into the same message. Jonah chapter 3, verse 2. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. It's the exact same message. It's a little bit different this time, I guess. The first time God speaks pretty harshly. He says, I want you to go pronounce judgment on them, right? Like you need to go and preach against them because of their wickedness. This time it's a little bit different. He says, just go and I'm going to give you a message. And this time it's different because in verse 3, Jonah obeys. He goes this time. I imagine being in a fish for 3 days probably had something to do with that. But he goes, he obeys. And again, I told you, Jonah's a quick book. The very next verse, verse 4, we get his sermon. Not like the introduction, like this is it. This is the whole sermon. Some of you wish sermons were like this, right? But this is it. This is the whole sermon. This is the only thing that Jonah says to them. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. That's the message God gave him. Now surely he said other things to these people, but you can read through it. You can look through it. You will find nothing else of Jonah speaking directly to people in Nineveh, telling them anything other than these 8 words. And don't you know it? Revival breaks out. It's mind-blowing to me. That simple little message, and revival breaks out. Repentance takes place. The very next verse, verse 5, says, the Ninevites believed God. I wish you could understand how big of a statement that is. They believed it. We're talking about a people who are not God's people. We're talking about a God speaking to them who is not their God. And yet this message comes along and they hear it and they believe it. They receive it and they immediately go into repentance mode. Repentance breaks out through this city, completely unexpected. And it looks like this. They immediately begin repenting just as Jonah and his people would. It says they declared a fast, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. It says when the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is cool. It starts in the streets, and it builds up. And now the king of this city is responding in the same kind of a way. Repentance is sweeping through the city. It says then he issued a proclamation. The king now tells everybody. This isn't just a grassroots movement. Now there's authority from the top. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let any man or beast, herd or flock, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. But let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? I love this. Part of the decree is the king going, who knows, right? God may yet relent. I love that. God may yet relent. And with compassion, turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. What a scene. What an incredible scene of this very simple message, and people hear it and people respond. And even more mind-blowing, the very next verse, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion. Exactly what they hoped for. He had compassion and did not bring upon them the destruction that he had threatened. It's fascinating to me. And it also feels wrong, doesn't it? There's something wrong about this. It's not the way that it should be. Like grace here almost feels inappropriate. It almost feels irresponsible. It kind of feels a little bit reckless, doesn't it? That God would just do this. Do you remember last week we looked at the story of David? And David has this moment where the prophet Nathan approaches him and tells him this story and confronts David on his sin. And David, at the end of it, just very simply says, I have sinned. And then Nathan responds very simply, you're forgiven. And it feels like cheap. It feels like simple. It feels too simple. It feels too easy to just receive this grace. It feels wrong. It feels inappropriate. It feels irresponsible. It feels reckless. The very next verse, chapter 4, verse 1, says Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. You ever been there? Seeing God pour out grace in someone else's life and you didn't feel like it was appropriate? It says that he prayed to the Lord, Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? I want you to catch this. That is why I was so quick to flee Tarshish. Remember, we asked the question, why did he run? And we attributed it to fear. Oh, he just must have been scared. He had these visions of being skinned alive. He didn't want to be a part of that. Surely that's why Jonah didn't want to go? No. Jonah says, this is why I was so quick to leave Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God. I knew it. I knew that you're slow to anger and abounding in love. I knew that you're a God who relents from sending calamity. Isn't this fascinating? He's saying beautiful things, except he's angry and bitter. He's not celebrating these things. He's bitter about it. He's mad about the fact that God would be these ways. And in fact, he's so mad that he says, take away my life. I just want to be dead. Jonah would rather be dead than to witness God pouring grace into the lives of the Ninevites. What's interesting here? I think Jonah makes one of the most profound statements of grace that you'll find in all of Scripture. I think he makes one of the most profound statements here in verse 2. I think that when you read this, I think there's a part that you could maybe see, like maybe David would say this in the Psalms, right? But it probably fits better with like Peter in the Gospels making some sort of proclamation like this. Like, can't you see Peter saying this about Jesus in the Gospels? Can't you see Paul writing about this in the New Testament with the letters that he writes to the churches, and he's now like almost wanting to go poetic about the beauty of God's grace, and so he writes, like it fits so well in those kinds of spaces, but we're looking at an Old Testament prophet who's angry and bitter about how good God is. It's fascinating to me. It's almost like Jonah has reached back into the archives of his experiences with God. And he sees it. He sees, man, God looks for opportunities to just extend grace and compassion. It seems to take God a long time to get mad. It seems like God is just overflowing with love. It seems like God chooses not to give sinners what they deserve. And Jonah was fine with all those things in the past as long as it was directed towards him and towards his people. You see, Jonah wanted justice. Jonah looked at the Assyrians. He wanted justice. God insisted on mercy. Jonah wanted judgment. He wanted them to suffer the consequences of their actions. Instead, God opts for compassion, and Jonah is mad about it. Doesn't sometimes grace feel wrong? Sometimes grace feels inappropriate. Sometimes it feels irresponsible or reckless. See, Jonah's got a great theology. He understands very clearly who God is. It's just that his application was completely one-sided. And chapter 4 is this hilarious moment. It's funny to me. Jonah's thrown his little temper tantrum, watching Nineveh, hoping that it would just burn to the ground, and it's not. They're repenting and coming back to God, and God's giving them grace, and he's bitter and he's angry. And so God causes this vine, we're told. I don't like calling it a vine. I want to call it a weed. God causes this weed to crawl up behind him and cover him and gives him shade. And so he's kind of almost happy for a moment, right? And then the next day, God brings this worm, and it eats the vine, the weed, right? And it goes away, and now the sun's on him again, and there's this hot wind blowing on him, and Jonah is just upset. And we hear that same refrain. He says, God, I just wish I were dead. He is just so absolutely miserable, staring at a city that is receiving the grace of God. And then God says this. It's chapter 4, verse 11. It's the last thing that we see from God in this story. God tells Jonah, Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left. And many cattle as well. That statement's confusing to me, but we're going to move on. God says to Jonah, should I not be concerned about that great city? Shouldn't I care? Jonah was more concerned about a vine that was giving him shade than the salvation of a city. He could not have cared any less about Nineveh and the Assyrians. That's the Old Testament, right? That's just some old guy who lived a long, long time ago who was apparently having some problems, right? That's not normal, is it? In the New Testament, there's a moment when Jesus tells a story. He's talking to a wide range of people. It's a wide spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who are overtly religious, all right? They are so religious and they're so serious about God that just by looking at them, you can tell that they're very serious about trying to please and love and worship God, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, you have a group of people who are embarrassingly far from God. They lived in such a way, they did things or they behaved certain ways, they had professions, whatever it may be, that it was clear and obvious to everybody that they are far from God, okay? And Jesus is teaching this story, he's just telling this little nice story, and he's got this wide spectrum of people on opposite ends and everybody in between, and they're all listening to this story. And so Jesus tells them about the prodigal son. You may be familiar with this one as well. Jesus says that there was a son who was so stuck up that he wished his father was dead. He didn't care about anybody else. He only cared about himself. And so he wished his father was dead. And so he asks for an early inheritance, meaning he wants from his father what he would get when his father was dead, but he doesn't want to wait for his father to die. And so he takes all the stuff. He wastes it in complete depravity. He finds himself incredibly impoverished. And so he has to get a job. He finds a job in a highly offensive field. And then he walks home, hoping, crossing his fingers, thinking maybe, just maybe, my father, he won't accept me as a son, but maybe he'll accept me as a servant. My father has servants who live better than I do. If I go home, maybe I can be his servant. And Jesus says that as he's walking home, the father sees him a long way off, and he runs to him in celebration, completely unexpected. The son tries to say what he's going to say, but the father cuts him off. The father instead throws a lavish party to celebrate the return of his son. And it's a powerful story of grace. Powerful story of grace. And you have those people in the crowd, the ones who are embarrassingly far from God. And what they hear, what they find out is that they aren't as far from God as they thought they were. It's a powerful story, and it should have ended there. It'd been a perfect place to end the story. But Jesus just keeps talking. There's more to this story. Jesus reveals that there's another brother, an older brother, a better brother. He was faithful to his father. He respected his father. He worked hard for the family. He never asked for anything. He loved and he served and he obeyed and he hated the party. Oh, he hated it. He was angry. He refused to go in, but he got close enough so that everybody could see that he was refusing to go in. Throwing his own little pity party outside. The father looks for him and wonders why the son isn't inside and with them and joining the party, and he finds the older son standing outside of the party, and he goes to him to plead with him to come in and celebrate. Instead, the older brother complains. And he tells the father that he doesn't appreciate the lack of grace that he had received, which was something that I think he had never even cared about until he saw someone else get more. Does grace ever feel wrong to you? Does it ever feel inappropriate to you that someone else would get more than you? Does it ever feel like it's reckless or wild or inappropriate? On the older brother's list of concerns, the return of his brother ranked so far below his own desire for a party that he didn't even know that he wanted until he saw someone else have one. And he looks a lot like Jonah. He looks like a guy with too much pride who's so focused on himself. And at the end of this story, it's in Luke chapter 15, verse 32. The last thing we see the father say to the son is this: we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. I love this. It's not because my son returned. It's because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. It sounds a lot like Jonah 4:11. Should I not be concerned? Should I not be concerned? It's a powerful story of ungrace. And there were those people in the crowd at that opposite end of the spectrum, the ones who were overtly religious and thought that they had the market cornered on who God was, and they believed they were very close to God. And at the end of the story, they realized that they were further from Him than they'd realized. But that's ancient time periods, right? It's the Old Testament. That's the New Testament. That's a long time ago. That's back when people hated each other so badly, right? That's not today, is it? Jesus' followers surely aren't the same way, right? In 2018, a song came out by a guy named Corey Asbury. A song called Reckless Love. You may be familiar with it. It played on a lot of worship stations, and it's been sung in many churches, including this one. We're going to sing it together here in just a moment. When the song came out, it created a lot of controversy. A lot of people had a problem with this song because they didn't appreciate the idea of calling anything that God does reckless. They felt like that wasn't very appropriate. And there was lots of people who spoke against it. I'll be honest with you, I've picked this guy. I don't know anything else about him, all right? That's kind of why I picked him, okay? I'm not singling him out. There was a lot of different people that I could have picked who spoke against this song. This is one of them. His name is, oh my goodness, I just lost my mark. Andrew Gabriel. He's a Pentecostal theologian. He thinks that the word reckless is not an accurate way to describe God or God's love. He said this. He said he looked up the word reckless in one dictionary, and it said without thinking or caring about the consequences of an action. He looked up the word reckless in a different dictionary, and it said it was marked by a lack of proper caution, careless of consequences, or irresponsible. And then he said this. He said, I don't think many Christians would like to say that God is careless or that God's love doesn't care about consequences. Instead, God loves us with clear and thoughtful intention. I completely agree with him. I don't think many Christians would like to say that. And yet the evidence seems to be otherwise. It seems like we have a God who is pretty wild with his grace, pretty reckless. In fact, by my standards, I think he is quite irresponsible, and I'm glad and grateful for it. I think Christians today get angry about God's wild grace just the same as God followers throughout history. We're uncomfortable with it. There's a guy named Andy Stanley. He's written tons of things. We're using one of his books for this series. This comes from a different book. He's speaking about Christians and how they become kind of puffed up in their relationship with God. Those same overtly religious people that we see Jesus speaking to, sometimes Christians can look that same way. And there's this spot where he talks about that. He says, not only do Christians, this isn't all Christians, but some Christians, not only do Christians believe in a literal hell, but you get the impression that they're happy about the fact that people are going there. You know any Christians with that reputation? Anyone who lives that kind of a way? Who isn't real excited about the grace of God in the lives of people around them? I mean, does grace ever feel wrong to you? Or inappropriate? Does grace ever feel reckless to you? Can you possibly think of anyone that in your mind should go to hell? In fact, you would prefer if they did. What if it was someone who hurt your kids? What if it was your ex? Maybe your ex's mother. What about Jeffrey Dahmer? We talked about him last week. Doc talked a lot about Jeffrey Dahmer and this incredibly horrific man and the unspeakable things that he did. And then in prison, he came to know Jesus. Is that an appropriate thing? Was it right for God to give him grace, to forgive him? What about your favorite political opponent? The person you dislike the most in government? What if today in the news you saw that they went to church this morning and came in contact with Jesus and repented, received God's grace? Would you celebrate that or would you question it? What about Jonah? What about the other brother? Is there grace for those guys, the ones who want to do what's right but they get it wrong sometimes? Is there any grace for the people who've hated you? Are you okay with God showing grace to them? There's a writer by the name Anne Lamont, a lady, writes this. She says, you can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. And I love this quote. I don't think we even need this last phrase. I think it's just the case. I think you can assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates. Because it's not him, it's you. It's not who he is. It's not what he does. Is it you? Is there any part of this that's in you? Is there anything within you that holds on to bitterness or anger? Is there any part of you that doesn't want to see people come to faith in Jesus? Is there any part of you that is skeptical of grace for other people when you're not center stage? And I hope you have a serious conversation about that this week. I hope you send that text. I hope you write that note. I hope you have a real conversation with someone and allow them to speak into your life and let them reveal if they see any bitterness or anger within you. Because it's not God, it's you. And for our guests, for those of you who this message was not for, I want you to hear two things today. If you have a negative stereotype or understanding of who Christians are, I want you to know that God has spoken pretty plainly and directly to them. And he seeks to hold them accountable. That their unlove, that their ungrace is not representative of their God. I also want you to hear this. I want you to see this. There is no length that God is not willing to take to get to you. He put a man in a fish for 3 days because he cared about one city. He sent a man to the world for 33 years, because he cared about it. We sang about it earlier. We're going to keep singing about it here. But I want you to hear this. However far you think you are from God, you are not nearly as far as you think. He is so close by. He's watching from a distance. He's waiting for you to turn towards him, and he's going to be right there. If that leads you, if that stirs something with you, I'd love to have a conversation with you. I'm going to be sitting right up here, right up front as we close out this service. We've got an elder in the prayer room that is praying for you right now and would love to have that conversation with you. If you want to know more about what it looks like to have a relationship with this God who loves recklessly, man, let's have that conversation. Why don't you stand and let's sing.